Welcome to the Business of Property podcast. I'm Simon.
And I'm Stuart.
We talk every week about the reality of running property businesses. Stuart runs a portfolio of co-living properties with a six-figure turnover and also has a property investment consultancy.
And Simon has a number of buy-to-lets and runs Patma, which is a leading portfolio management software system and a source of property market insights.
And as always, a quick request at the beginning of the episode. Please do follow the link in the show notes to join our email mailing list. We will be sending out an assortment of fun and interesting things as we progress. And we'd also like to give a shout out for anyone who might be interested in our Property Growth Club. If you are, please drop us an email to show@thebusinessofproperty.com. And this is a small group of property professionals who'll be talking regularly with Stuart and myself to help grow their property businesses throughout the year. So again, if you think that could be you and you're interested in joining, please do email show@thebusinessofproperty.com and we'll send you some more details. Now, we thought this week we would talk about something practical and actually happening in our businesses. So, of course, I thought, what's happening in my business at the moment? And unfortunately, I'm just stuck at the end, well, nearly the end, not quite the end. This is the stuck bit of a refurbishment that seems to be going on for almost ever, but certainly a few months. And I am not quite ready to share the details yet. But keep listening to future episodes because hopefully in the next week or two or maybe three, I will have completed this refurbishment and I will share all of the numbers. So the property purchase price, what I estimated the refurbishment would cost, the time I estimated it would take, and the actual reality of how it all turned out. So I might be crying by the end of the episode, but I will share all of the details.
We won't mention crypto. That usually definitely gets you to cry.
I've been really good, actually. I haven't looked at that recently. So I'm just pretending it doesn't exist and life is much better.
Well, like everybody else.
Right. So what are we actually talking about this week? And what we've chosen, seeing as I've got nothing interesting to say quite yet, is to talk about your business, Stuart. And following on a bit from what we mentioned last week about buying properties or not buying properties, you have decided at the moment not to buy any properties. So perhaps you can tell us a tiny bit about why that might be, but also what you have decided to do in your property business.
Yeah, it's less of a choice around the market conditions, which we talked about last week, and more of a choice around being focused on where I want my business to be. And for those of you that did listen to our words of the year, my previous word of the year was frustration. And it could be that again this year. But no, I selected profit. And that meant that I really wanted to focus on the profit of the business. That means, of course, reducing cost and increasing revenues. And we've started well on that, actually. We implemented the rent increases where the market said we should, not just because we wanted to, but where the market said we should and where it was right to do so. We have looked at costs and minimize those where we can. Sadly, the costs are going up in the business. If the energy increases are going to happen in April, my energy costs will increase by another 20%, which is, we're talking over £1,000 per month increase in the business. So my focus naturally went to what else can I do? The other costs I have in my business are investor interest. So I currently pay an investor monthly interest. And that is because we still have an amount of capital that is owed. So there is a focus on paying down that capital. Again, being very transparent on this podcast. And I can probably share more on this in the future once things are bit more done and dusted, because obviously there's some confidentiality around this, but essentially, so we're focused on paying down some capital. And then that kind of left me with, okay, what else can we do? So in posh language, what I wanted to do was focus on the property business where it was less capital intensive. And what that means is, where can I put less money to still increase revenue? And essentially that is in my leased property side of the business. And that means, so in my company, I have two arms, if you like, two business units. One is owned properties and one is leased properties. Some call that rent to rent, and essentially it is like that. But in a commercial space, essentially you're leasing properties from other entities. And so I see it as the leased property business. So in short, without being too corporate, I've focused on making sure we're bringing revenue into that business because we've been doing that business now for a few years. It has helped with revenues. We are working on costs. And so I focused on building that pipeline and bringing more properties into the business. And we've got 2 or 3 properties that are going to come into the business.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it being less capital intensive. And I think this sort of strategy, if you like, property strategy of rent to rent is often sold in that way, in so much as if you're sort of a newbie to property and you are looking at property courses and that kind of information that's out there, a lot of it will be promoting rent to rent as a sort of easy to start and no capital needed and that sort of thing. But I think it's important to say that it is low capital investment. It's not zero capital investment, is it? And it does require some input from you.
Absolutely. It requires quite a bit of input from me. And I think the other important thing to add to what you've just said, a really important thing from my perspective, is it took me some time to get to this stage of building lots of relationships with builders, local agents, and so on. So when you mentioned property courses, that's a little red flag to me to say, I don't think it happens as they say it might, which is you send out a letter, you get a response, and you take over a property for free, and you start making money. I just don't think it's that simple because it's business, and business is not that simple. So when I talk about it, it's because, and I'm trying to say this with as much humility as possible, it's taken a lot of blood, sweat and tears to get to a stage where I believe I can onboard new properties with minimal capital expenditure. And there is always capital expenditure. But again, as a business, we've learned how to manage that in a much better way. And I would say, it is very low capitally intensive because at some stages we can get access to properties before we even take them over. And we can get rents in before costs come out. Sometimes, not all the time, sometimes. And again, it's taken a while for me to get to that stage and be where I'm very confident with that. And also the business is generating revenue, so we can afford to take on some costs now as well. So you're absolutely right. And I think that is definitely a watch out that we should always preempt any conversation with this about, is that it's not a free shot. But that's, without wishing to sound negative, this is just hopefully the reality. We talk about reality, and this is the reality of doing this. Can it be a really profitable property strategy? Absolutely, and it can be, and it is really, really helping my business. In fact, in terms of growing revenues, and we will be by the end of 2023, 2024, a very significant business, including all of it, a good high 6-figure turnover business. The only caveat I'll apply to that is, we're talking before recording, turnover is good, but profit right now isn't right, which is why it's the focus of my year. In fact, we lost money last year. However, I'm projecting to make money next year because I'm told that is the objective of business.
Yeah, I think. It's not always that easy, is it? But yes, I think that's the overall objective.
Well, this is the thing. You and I have been doing this for several years plus. And I think we've earned some stripes to be able to talk about business and property as a business. And I'm not saying it always has to be really difficult, but my experience has been that it is bloody hard. And I think in the next 12 months, we'll get to a stage where the business, I can actually sit back and look at the business and go, right, I've now a business that I'm proud of and happy of. But I'm, digressing slightly from the main topic in hand, which is the focus on growing the leased property side of the business.
Indeed. So you mentioned property courses that suggest you send out a few letters and landlords throw themselves, or rather their properties, at your feet. And I'm sure this is exactly what happened for you, isn't it? Yes.
Well, in some ways, yes. No one's ever thrown themselves at my feet. In fact, one of the properties that we're going to take on at the back end of this year, we won't actually take it on until the final quarter of this year, actually. But I've been in conversations with the homeowner probably for a year and a half, maybe a bit longer. And that is my business model as well, is that I like to build relationships. This shouldn't just be, look, there is a transaction, and I did send out letters. And of course, we do this podcast and I do other activity. And sometimes people get in touch with me and ask me if I can help. And we have those conversations. But historically, what I've done is send out letters. That itself is now getting really hard to get to do that because of the rules around GDPR and getting that functionality. But as always, there's always a way to do it. But essentially, we'd done a few campaigns a couple of years ago, have done some more recently than that. But it takes time. It is definitely slow burn. And I certainly wouldn't expect to get 10 properties in 1 month. There might be people out there that have done that. That's not my experience. It was a case of, and quite rightly so, that the homeowners that come to me are people that have had enough. And that's why they want to work with someone like me to take it off their hands.
I think that's an interesting point to pick up on, actually, because you've got some existing leased rent properties and you're taking on new ones. What situations have those landlords been in? We see in the press at the moment a lot of noise around landlords wanting to exit the sector and primarily choosing to sell properties. But the landlords that are leasing properties to you are effectively sort of exiting to some degree, as in they are stepping back from their properties. Why are they doing that? What have you seen in the past, and what are you seeing now, and has it changed?
Typically, the people that will come to us are either retirees, so this is their pension. It was, they might be unencumbered properties, i.e. they most likely don't have a mortgage on them. They don't want to get rid of them. They're just fed up with all of the shenanigans that comes with renting a property. And, our service promises to remove that. The next question, people say, well, surely they just get a letting agent. Well, yes, but with a letting agent, you still have to field the question. Even if it's fully managed, you're still going to get contact. And so for the retirees, they want the property. They'd like to keep some revenue from the property, but ultimately they just want that big asset kept in the background so that whatever their family situation is, it's there for them in the future. So that's one group. And then the other group, I would say, are people that are professional. And again, I'd say there's probably no gender bias, but it's professional men, women who have bought to invest in the area, and property's not doing as well as it should and is causing them a few headaches. And again, those headaches come to them via agents. So, the key thing they're looking for is exactly the same as the other group, which is that they kind of want to keep the property. They like to have the property, the asset. A couple of those have looked at selling, but market wasn't quite right for them. And funnily enough, and I say funnily enough, and this is I guess my benefit is that I am an investor in the area as well as running this service. So I can talk with them on a peer-to-peer basis, if that makes sense, because I totally get their situation. And I can explain that, and they know I understand it. So, for example, someone recently said, I'd really prefer to sell my property. However, I'm not getting the value I want for it. If I knocked it down to the price that someone is offering me, I then have these things called ERCs. And I say, yeah, I'm well aware of early redemption charges. About to pay some of those myself. So then they know that I totally get the situation. So then they have, I've built that credibility that I know what the situation is. So then, and essentially then, so they'd like to sell it, but it's not the right time, but they don't want to think about it anymore. And I think that is the thing for any of them, regardless of which sort of group they come from. It's just they don't want to have to think about the property anymore. And I think that is the benefit of the service. Because, and I think I've shared this before on the podcast, although we have certain rules in the contract about, a ceiling maintenance fee, for example. So we might cover the maintenance costs, and I'm plucking numbers out of the air, but we might say, okay, we'll cover reactive maintenance up to the tune of £150 or £200 per month. Sometimes the maintenance might cost more than that. Hopefully not, because that eats into my profit margin. But it might be £10, £15, £20 more than that, and I'll just swallow it because I've sat in their chair. I've even looked at this service for myself before I started my own company. And so I understand it. So I'm like, okay, if it's really not that significant, I'm just going to take it so that I don't have to contact the client. And that gives them exactly what they want. And, the main thing for them that I've realised is they just want to see that money come in on the same date every month. As long as that happens, because a couple of them have been a bit nervous about that. In fact, I think we shared it on this podcast before that, there was once I was one day late once because bank holiday weekend, blah, blah, blah. And I think they were getting quite anxious. On the day they phoned me to see where the money was, they got a package from me because it was their year anniversary with my company, and I'd sent out a little hamper. And I think that kind of just all of a sudden, because they were a bit worried, oh no, is this a fly-by-night company and they're going to run away with the property? And then they got this hamper as well as getting the payment. They're like, oh, okay, no, we're really sorry. We're just really worried. Yeah, so it's more around just... I think, without sounding glib, they just want peace of mind and security for whatever service that they go for.
Yeah, I think, as you said, in order to really provide that, it's all about building relationships and reassuring people that, as you say, you're still going to be there tomorrow.
Yeah.
It just takes time to do that. I don't think it's something that you can set up one day and convince people of the next day.
No, it's firmly based in credibility, and that's the other thing, because I am very open with customers, potential customers, and I actually explain the business model to them. I say, look, this is how I price it. I'll give you a breakdown of how I've got to the figure that I'm going to pay you, and I'll be honest with you. This is what I say to them. I'll be honest with you. I probably won't make any money from this property for 6 to 12 months. That's the reality, because by the time I've invested into it, done what I need to do to it or whatever. So that's why the contract terms have to be usually around 5 years. Some might be a little bit less, but I say, look, I don't make any money for this amount of time. And that's why it has to be a long-term agreement. And also, when I've had a couple of people say, well, and some people will say, well, why should I trust you? And I would say, look up my company online. I implore you, just search me on Companies House, and you'll find I can just hear a flurry of keyboards getting pressed now. The people looking at my company on Companies House. But it's there, and I say to them, look, it shows you that my company exists. It has existed since November 2016. There are assets in the company, albeit that fluctuates, but there is a significant amount of assets in the company. So we're not. And it's interesting because they're like, they're kind of surprised that I'm pushing them down that road, because I think sometimes not everyone's as that open. And I did actually have one guy that I was talking to said, I came to you because he'd already done his research, or this customer had already done their research, and said, I came to you because I looked at this other company online, and it might have been on Companies House for a month, but there was nothing that, there's no filings been done, no company. So it was very hard for them to understand whether or not the company even really existed. And some companies that even have had filings, there's nothing there. So there is a lot to be said about that credibility.
Indeed. So we said at the beginning of this, we're going to talk about the practicalities, and I'm not sure we've quite got there very much. So let's try before we finish. So what are you having to do sort of as everyday actions in order to get new properties onboarded?
Yeah, so obviously once we've got the potential candidates, potential customers in, we have conversations. And typically I'll do a quote very, very quickly. That's the first, because neither the customer nor I want to waste time if it's not going to be what they're looking for. So I'll do a quote very quickly, usually within 24 hours, get them a quote. And if they're happy, I will send them a draft of the contract, not because we're thinking about contracting at that stage, but just because I want them to see that we have things in place already. We've got a 20-page contract that covers lots of elements, a lot of them in their favour, as it should be, because they're the homeowners. I'll also ask for a couple of things around insurance documents, proof of ownership, that kind of stuff, to make sure that those are all in place. HMO license, obviously, if it's an HMO. And then if both parties are happy, then I suggest that I have to go around and have a look at the property, and I'll have a walk around to see what condition it's in, if it's property that we'd like to look at. And this is the other thing. I mean, I know the area very, very well now. So typically, I shouldn't say this in case any potentials are listening, but I probably know if I'd like the property, even just knowing where it is in terms of the address. However, I have to see the internals just to make sure there's nothing horrifically wrong with it.
Yeah.
Before we sign it up. So they're the key things. Once I've had a walk around, if I'm happy that what we've offered still aligns with what the property current condition is, then we just formalise it, get them to sign a contract. And then essentially it's really about one I've got at the moment. It's already got existing tenants. That's quite it's complicated in the sense that obviously we just have to manage that. So they have to hand over the tenants to me. However, as you can imagine, these situations, more often than not, the tenants are on periodic tenancies. Mm-hmm. And that's another reason. The homeowners are just fed up with dealing with all of that. So we'd have to turn around and offer all new contracts at the rates we want to offer and deal with that tenant management process. And then really, once that's dealt with, we're into just the same as we would in a property-owned situation, which is, okay, we've got to go out and find tenants, fill rooms, and carry out ongoing maintenance.
Yeah, that makes it sound so easy.
It's not.
I think everyone should be doing it.
It really isn't. And it does sound easy because I'm summarising in the interests of our time and this podcast. But I would say it's not easy.
Okay, so let's take that then. It's not easy. So what's the most challenging element of that process?
The most challenging aspect I would refer back to is the development of the relationships that you need. So my model is predicated on using existing agents that we have that support our owned portfolio. Now, without sounding too corporate, that means I just get some economies of scale because we're already doing certain things for properties I own, so I'm kind of extending that service out. However, I'm still paying an agency fee for that. Now, most people that do rent to rent and would manage the tenant aspect themselves and make whatever the number is, between 10 and 15% for themselves. And that makes perfect sense. And if I had the time and or inclination, I might do that myself. However, I have neither of those things. So I am happy to lose X percent in terms of my turnover to get that managed, provided the profitability is there. So I would say, the two things are actually having the relationships you need to make sure that you can run that portfolio well. Because I think if you're going to do rent to rent, you have to have really good, if not maximum occupancy most of the time. And I know that sounds ridiculously stupid to say, but if it's your own property, you might be able to stomach one room being empty for a month or two. If it's rent to rent, if it's a leased property, your margin just disappeared and you're making no money. So why are we doing it? So it's really key to make sure that everything is in play to have that occupancy and all of those things that we've just mentioned have to happen. You have to have good maintenance. Everything has to be in good condition. You have to respond quickly to make sure that tenants aren't disappearing quite quickly.
Yeah, so you want to try and keep your tenants as much as you can. So keep them happy, keep the household happy, and hopefully avoid the voids. Yeah. So you, if and when tenants do leave, you need to get them refilled as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
To avoid the very instant sort of potential of losing money on that property because the margins are a bit tighter.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say, you have to be all over the numbers. And this has taken me some time to do. I've got various spreadsheets, but now I've just got into a place where Zero is updated by my bookkeeper. I'll give him a shout out when next time I find his name. He's based in Bangalore. I've got a bookkeeper that updates my Xero for me. And I can now I'm now getting I think we've got our latest figures up to January, and I can now split out revenue, costs, utilities within Xero, which shows me each property's performance. Because if a property isn't performing, I need to know pretty straight away. Basically, it has to be current data. It's still lagging because obviously I'm behind. So, lead indicators are, are we going out to the property often? Are we getting call outs, etc. But I have to know that those properties are making money. And like I said earlier on, I'm not expecting to make huge amounts of money for the first 12 months, but we need to be at a place of break even, certainly within a year and a half. And that's not the dream you're sold when you get these courses. It's you're making money from day one. So, my experience isn't that, but it took us a while, and we've got a number of rooms now on this basis.
Indeed. So I think we are probably out of time, and we need to finish up on that dose of reality, and not to be sucked in by the sales pitches of some popular property courses. And remember that the reality is often not the same as the sales pitch. We will keep coming back every week to talk to you about that reality of property. Before we do go this week, I would just like to take the opportunity to put in a small request for a quick rating or review in whatever podcast player you're using, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any of the many, many others that are out there. If you could scroll down in it and give us a quick 5-star rating, Stuart and I would really appreciate that. And you can find show notes for this episode and all other episodes on thebusinessofproperty.com. And Stuart and I look forward to chatting to you again next week.